My name is Allison Brooks, and if you had walked into the break room that Friday evening, you would have seen confetti falling balloons swaying in the air and half-empty champagne glasses scattered across every counter. People were laughing, slapping each other on the back, and snapping selfies under the company banner that read, "Historic Milestone 400% Growth." And right in the middle of that chaos was my creation, the analytics system I had built line by painstaking line of code through countless sleepless nights. The screens on the wall flashed live metrics like fireworks, flawless uptime, seamless dashboards, real-time reporting across every department. It was beautiful. It was alive. It was mine. But as the champagne cork burst and sprayed across the mounted flat screen, a different thought gnawed inside me. Everyone was celebrating. Everyone was getting credit. Everyone was feeding on the success of something they hadn't bled for. And deep down, I already knew I wouldn't see a single dime of the reward. That's the part no one tells you about corporate victories. They don't belong to the people who grind for them. They belong to the managers who stroll in at the end and smile for the camera. I stood on the edge of the room sipping a lukewarm, sparkling water, and I felt invisible, like my own work had become a party trick for others to brag about. The applause, the toasts, the laughter, it all blurred into static. I watched the vice president of sales hand out those goofy foil balloons that said "the GOAT," as if the whole department had magically transformed into geniuses overnight. The product lead posed for a photo beside the dashboard I had coded during a snowstorm last February, my laptop balanced on a radiator, while I prayed the servers wouldn't collapse. Yet here in the break room glow, no one remembered. No one even looked my way. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger is hot, reckless, noisy. What I felt was something colder, heavier. A fatigue that sinks into your bones when you realize you've become nothing more than a line item on someone else's success story. And then in that moment, watching my code light up the monitors while others clapped themselves on the back, I had a revelation. It wasn't just about money or credit or bonuses. It was about dignity, about ownership, about the kind of freedom that comes when you refuse to let anyone else define your worth. Because deep inside, under the exhaustion and the numbness, something sharper clicked into place. I remembered the clause I had fought to insert into the licensing agreement 2 years ago. A single sentence buried under pages of legal jargon, invisible to anyone who hadn't bled for this system. A clause that tied the company's right to use this platform, my platform, to one condition: my compensated employment. They thought I was replaceable, that they could steal my thunder, deny my bonus, and walk away like nothing happened. But as I stood there with confetti under my shoes and hollow cheers in my ears, I knew better. This wasn't just their party, it was the calm before the storm. And while the rest of them drank champagne, I quietly raised my lukewarm, sparkling water, took one last sip, and promised myself, if they dare cut me out, I won't need to shout. The system will speak for me. The next morning, when the dust of confetti had barely settled into the carpet, Don, the man with the $9 haircut and a permanent smirk, strolled into the office like he owned the place. He carried himself with that effortless arrogance of someone who had never spent a night debugging an infinite loop or nursing a dying server back to life at 3 a.m. His coffee was steaming, his shirt freshly pressed. Meanwhile, I still had the faint smell of cold pizza lingering on my jacket from the launch night. He spotted me at my desk, walked straight over, and patted me on the shoulder, as if I were a loyal pet who had fetched the ball without complaint. "Quick thing," he said casually, like it was an afterthought. "Your bonus isn't going through this cycle. Policy stuff, you get it." For a second I thought I misheard. The words seemed too absurd to register. "Policy," I repeated. He nodded already, glancing at his phone as if the conversation was beneath him. "Yeah. Upper management is cracking down on post-launch incentives. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." The phrase hit me like an insult wrapped in velvet. As if the weekends I'd sacrificed weren't personal. As if the birthdays I'd missed, the family dinners I'd canceled, and the nights I sat alone in my apartment watching error logs stream across the screen weren't personal. As if my entire life had not been bent, reshaped, and consumed by the system that had just put this company on the map. I wanted to laugh, scream, throw my laptop across the room. Instead, I nodded once. Got it. 2 small words. No fight, no protest. Don smirked like he'd won something, then walked away sipping his overpriced latte. But what I really got was this: they believed I was disposable. They thought the woman who had rebuilt their data stack from the ashes of a contractor's half-finished garbage heap could be filed under cost containment. That they could erase me from the story, and I'd simply keep smiling, keep coding, keep carrying the weight of their ignorance on my back. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Not rage, not revenge, something far more dangerous clarity. I remembered the clause, the one line buried deep in the licensing agreement hidden behind addendums and subsections. In the event that the designated technical lead is removed from compensated employment status for any period exceeding 72 hours, this license agreement shall be considered null and void. That clause was my shield, my insurance policy, my kill switch. And Don in his arrogance had just pulled the pin. I sat back in my chair staring at the hum of servers through the glass wall. Everyone else bustled with energy meetings reports, congratulatory emails. But to me, it was as if the office had gone silent, like someone had turned down the volume of the world. I felt calm. Too calm. Because now I understood every chart, every dashboard, every investor report depended on one thing, me being paid. And I wasn't. Don thought this was about saving the company money, but what he had really done was declare war on the very foundation of their empire. And the beauty of it, I didn't need to fight. I didn't need to storm into HR or rant on Slack. I just had to wait. Before I tell you how I turned that silence into the loudest message of my career, let me ask you something. Have you ever been told it's just policy when what they really meant was you don't matter? Drop your story in the comments. And if you're tired of watching people like Don get away with this, make sure you subscribe. We share stories here that corporations would rather bury. Back at my desk, I opened my encrypted folder. There it was, the PDF, the contract, my hidden landmine. I highlighted the clause again, my finger tracing each word like a vow. They thought they had outmaneuvered me. But in reality, they had walked blindfolded into a minefield. Don believed he had clipped my wings. What he didn't know was that I had built the very cage he was standing in, and the key to the lock was sitting right there under my name. And when the time was right, I would turn that key. When Don walked away, that morning smirk curling at the edges of his mouth, I sat frozen at my desk for a long moment. Not because I was shocked I'd seen enough corporate games to know how the story usually ends, but because I realized something no one else in that building had remembered. That clause. 2 years earlier, when this company nearly collapsed under the weight of a botched analytics rebuild, I had been the last person left standing. They had tried outsourcing the work to a self-proclaimed 10x engineer in Austin who treated documentation like a joke and believed deadlines were optional. I stumbled onto the Slack thread by accident, Don and his buddies discussing how Allison's too protective, too opinionated. She's a cost inefficiency. Let's cut her out. I remember sitting there staring at the messages, the cold dread hardening into steel resolve. If they were going to play games with my livelihood, I needed a weapon they couldn't see. So when the vendor's legal team sent over the draft agreement, I didn't passively forward it to procurement like everyone else did. I rolled up my sleeves. I studied every comma, every subsection, every hidden loophole, and I found a way to write myself into the bones of that contract. It took 2 weeks of back-and-forth red lines and late-night calls with the vendors' council. I argued, negotiated, twisted their arm until they finally relented. Buried deep in Appendix D, subsection 3, paragraph B was a single sentence. In the event that the designated technical lead defined in Addendum B by name is removed from compensated employment status for any period exceeding 72 hours, this license agreement shall be considered null and void. All associated access rights shall terminate without further notice. My name, my employment, my compensation. It wasn't there by accident. It was born out of spite, out of survival, out of a refusal to ever let them erase me quietly. If they wanted to use the vendor's platform, they had to keep paying me. End of story. Now here we were in the bright aftermath of a historic launch, and Don had casually told me my bonus was gone. That clause didn't care about his smirk or policy stuff. The moment I was unpaid, the clock started ticking. I leaned back, staring at the monitors glowing across the office. Those dashboards, the ones everyone was using to prep their investor decks, were ticking time bombs. In 72 hours, they'd all be gone. And the only person who could save them was the one they had just dismissed as too expensive. I didn't slam my laptop shut or storm into HR. That would have been too obvious, too loud. No, the power of this clause wasn't in shouting, it was in silence. in waiting. I opened my encrypted folder, highlighted the clause again, and felt a strange calm wash over me. This wasn't rage. Rage burns too quickly. This was colder, sharper. This was leverage. It hit me then Dawn and the others had never read the contract. Not really. They skimmed the summaries, the PowerPoint bullets, the key takeaways. But no one except me had dug into the legal marrow of that agreement. That ignorance was my shield. Their arrogance was my weapon. I wasn't powerless anymore. I was the heartbeat of their empire, and with one withheld bonus, Dawn had just stopped feeding it oxygen. And before I take you deeper into how this clause changed everything, let me ask you, have you ever fought to protect yourself in a world that wanted to cut you out? If you've had to hide your own insurance policy just to survive, share it below. Your story matters here. The office buzzed around me, meetings, scheduled reports sent pats on the back, flying left and right. No one knew what I held in my hands. To them, I was just another cog quietly grinding away. But I knew better. The grenade was already buried under their shiny new foundation. Dawn had just yanked out the pin, and I was the only one who knew how long the fuse would burn. I didn't shout. I didn't run to HR or throw my badge on the desk in defiance. Instead, I slipped back into my seat as though nothing had happened. Around me, the office thrummed with post-launch energy product managers gushed about Q4 roadmaps, sales reps rehearsed their investor pitches, and interns scurried around with trays of leftover sheet cake that now tasted like chalk. To them, everything was normal. To me, the countdown had already begun. The silence inside my head was deafening like the pause between thunder and lightning. Don thought he had closed the book on me with a single sentence about policy stuff. What he didn't realize was that I had just opened an entirely different chapter 1, where I held the pen and the ending was mine to write. I opened a secure folder on my laptop labeled simply Insurance. Within it were copies of everything: contract drafts, Slack threads where I had been erased, architecture diagrams stamped with my name, and time-stamped commits proving authorship. Every artifact of the system's birth was mine, and now they sat like sharpened blades waiting for the right moment. I highlighted the clause again, tracing it slowly as though I were carving it into stone. It had been my lifeline, once a desperate safeguard against being discarded. Now it was my weapon. I remembered the meeting rooms where I fought to have that clause included. Don had dropped the ball entirely. He didn't even show up. Procurement wanted the deal signed quickly, but I refused to rubber stamp it. I fought through legal jargon, through eye rolls and sighs, through 2 weeks of "why are you being so difficult," until the vendor finally gave in. That fight had nearly broken me back then. Today, it would break them. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to scan dashboards while my mind wandered through every possible outcome. If I did nothing, they would go on stealing credit and denying recognition until I vanished into a footnote. If I acted, the entire company could grind to a halt in less than 3 days. It wasn't revenge I wanted, it was recognition. Proof that I wasn't disposable. Proof that without me, their empire was nothing more than glass built on sand. As the day wore on, I played my role perfectly. I answered technical questions with a smile, sent out high-priority reports without delay, even laughed politely at a joke I didn't hear. No one suspected a thing. To them, I was still the workhorse, reliable, invisible, compliant. But behind the mask, I was sharpening my knife. And if you're watching this thinking, "I've been there too, I've done the work," while someone else took the credit, then let me whisper this to you: you are not alone. Drop a comment if you've ever had your efforts erased. Because here we name it. Here we don't let it vanish. And if you're new, make sure to subscribe. This is where we shine light on the stories companies would rather bury. By 5 p.m., the building felt strangely hollow. People still buzzed about our baby system as though they had birthed it themselves. My name was already fading from the narrative, my face already disappearing from the story. I walked out at exactly 6, not a minute late, a hard drive tucked carefully in my bag. Encrypted, time-stamped, every dependency mapped. Because when the system failed, and it would, they'd need a miracle. And by then, I had already decided I wouldn't be in the building when they begged for one. I passed Don in the hallway on my way out. He was laughing loudly into his Bluetooth headset about centralizing insights. He didn't even glance at me. He had no idea the rope was already tightening around his neck. The confetti from the party still clung to the rug near the elevator. I looked down at one glittering piece stuck to my shoe. I peeled it off, let it fall, and whispered to myself, This is the last celebration they'll ever have without paying me. And with that, I stepped into the elevator doors, closing on their borrowed triumph doors, opening on the war I was about to unleash. Monday morning arrived with the stale smell of donuts and denial. I walked into the office to find the official post-mortem of our launch circulating across inboxes like gospel scripture. Everyone was praising the leadership team, clapping each other on the back, marveling at the so-called brilliance that had delivered our company to new heights. I opened the PDF expecting at least a nod, a mention, a single line of acknowledgement. Instead, what I saw made my stomach twist. Every chart in that report had been pulled directly from the dashboards I designed. The architecture diagrams were identical to the ones I'd drawn on napkins during late-night coding sessions. Even the phrases, specific technical descriptions I had written in Slack were copied verbatim. But the bylines, the signatures. The names in bold at the bottom of the report, they belonged to Don, the VP of Operations, and the product lead who still asked me what a data warehouse was. My name was gone. To the world outside, I had ceased to exist. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a bullet point. Cross-functional input, team effort. For a long minute, I stared at the glowing screen, feeling the heat rise up my neck. Then I closed the PDF, opened a new local folder, and labeled it Insurance. Inside, I began dragging everything: design drafts, commit histories, time-stamped architecture diagrams, Slack threads with my words, every version of every document I had ever touched. Each file was a piece of truth, a weapon forged in silence. Not out of anger, anger burns out too quickly, but out of preparation. A war doesn't start with a cannon blast. It starts with someone quietly sharpening a knife. I didn't send a snarky email. I didn't drop passive-aggressive emoji reactions in Slack. I didn't even forward the report to myself with bitter comments. I simply kept working steady and calm while building my arsenal. Because I knew one thing: they thought they could erase me, but they didn't understand how dangerous invisibility can be. By noon, murmurs were already drifting through the office. A DevOps engineer asked if legal had cleared the final vendor clauses. He mentioned something weird in Appendix D. I kept my eyes on my screen, cleaning up cash flow reports, hiding the faint smile tugging at my lips. The arrogance of leadership was breathtaking. They had stolen my words, my architecture, my code, and still they strutted around as though the ground beneath them wasn't already cracking. I thought of Don's smug face as he told me it's not personal. Well, this was personal. Every sleepless night, every missed family dinner, every drop of blood I'd poured into the system, it was personal. And now with each file I saved into Insurance, I was writing the story they tried to delete. And if you've ever had your name stripped from your own work, if you've watched someone else sign off on your labor while you were shoved into the shadows, tell me. Share it below. Because this channel isn't just about my story, it's about all of ours. And if you're tired of being erased, hit subscribe. This is where we make sure our voices don't vanish. I left the office that evening with my hard drive heavier and my patience lighter. Outside, the sun was setting, casting the glass towers of downtown in a fiery orange. To most people, it was a beautiful evening. To me, it was a warning glow, the sky itself reminding me that even the tallest structures can burn when the foundation is rotten. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag. Don thought he had silenced me. What he didn't know was that every document I carried out of that building was another nail for his coffin. And when the fire finally came, no report or signature could save him. I came in the next day carrying nothing more than my badge and a face carved into neutrality. To everyone else, it was just another Tuesday. To me, it was day 2 of the countdown. I sat at my desk, logged into the dashboards, and kept moving as if nothing had changed. Emails, syncs, Jira tickets, another round of, can you just pull this one quick report from product? Outwardly, I was steady. Inwardly, I was marking time. 72 hours. That was all the contract gave them. 72 hours of unpaid status before the license self-destructed. Don thought he had won. What he had really done was set a timer. The cruel irony was that every single thing they celebrated, every chart splashed across boardroom presentations, every metric fueling investor optimism, it all flowed through the veins of a system whose heartbeat was tied to me. I wasn't just part of the machine. I was the fuse. By lunchtime, the office felt like a different world. Sales was already spinning, Q4 projections, marketing was scheduling victory campaigns, and the VP of Ops was drafting an internal memo about leveraging our momentum. They were polishing their trophies while standing on a cliff edge. I leaned back listening to their chatter and wondered how long it would take before someone noticed the silence beneath the noise. The silence of a clause buried in legal ink. The silence of a system preparing to go dark. I didn't need to rush. In fact, rushing would have ruined everything. No, I had to be ordinary, invisible, reliable. I answered every email on time. I joined every meeting with a calm face. I even cracked a small laugh when someone joked about sleeping under our desks for this baby. None of them realized the baby had a kill switch, and I was the one who held it. It was almost intoxicating, the knowledge that I carried a secret capable of stopping their empire cold. That Don, who strutted around like a king, was walking straight into a noose he didn't even see. That night, as the building emptied, I stayed back a few minutes, staring at the monitors glowing in the dim office light. The numbers kept rolling flawless and efficient. But I knew the truth, those numbers only lived because I was still here. The moment the contract flipped from compensated to withheld, the system would die, and the world would know exactly who kept it alive. Before shutting down my laptop, I whispered to myself, let them keep smiling. Let them keep pretending. The countdown has already started. And maybe you felt this too, that eerie calm when you realize the power is actually in your hands, even if no one else can see it. If you've ever sat silently knowing the tables would soon turn, leave me a comment. And if you want to hear how this timer finally hit 0, subscribe now. This is only the beginning. When I left the office, the streets were quiet, the skyscrapers glowing like hollow trophies against the night. I carried nothing but my hard drive and the certainty that I wasn't powerless anymore. Don had stolen my bonus. Leadership had erased my name. But in doing so, they had lit the fuse themselves. And now all I had to do was wait for the explosion. By the third day, the whisper started. It always begins that way, in half sentences traded over lukewarm coffee in questions disguised as jokes. One of the DevOps engineers, a guy who lived in hoodies and carried a mug that said, "World's okayest engineer," leaned back in his chair and asked almost casually, "Hey, did anyone ever clear Appendix D with legal before launch?" The words landed like a pebble dropped in a still pond. A few heads turned. Someone laughed it off. Legal skimmed it right. That's what they do. If there was an issue, we'd know by now. I kept my eyes locked on my screen, clicking through post-launch cash reports, forcing my face into a mask of disinterest. But inside, I smiled a faint private smile, because the pebble had been dropped and soon the ripples would become waves. I remembered every sleepless night I had spent negotiating that clause. The red lines, the stubborn vendor lawyer, the exasperated procurement officer who said I was slowing progress. No one cared back then. But now that one sentence, my sentence was about to haunt them. Around noon, I slipped into the break room. The cake from launch was still there, dry and cracked frosting, hardened into something closer to plaster than sugar. Across the top in red icing, someone had written, "Success." The U sagged like a drunk smile. I stared at it for a long time, fork idle in my hand, thinking about the irony. Outside the window, the city buzzed. Inside, HR laughed with sales product managers sketched future roadmaps, and Don strutted past Bluetooth in his ear, bragging about centralizing insights. He didn't even glance my way. I wasn't supposed to exist outside the code. But the truth was, I existed in every line of that code, and in every clause of the contract that kept it breathing. Later that afternoon, I pulled the license up again. Not just the highlighted section, but the whole thing, page after page. I traced the signatures, the timestamps, the legalese no one else bothered to read. I knew exactly what would happen if this clause was triggered. It wouldn't just be a breach of contract. It would be system-wide blackout chaos. Investor calls would freeze. Compliance officers would circle like vultures. I closed the document, exhaled slowly, and leaned back in my chair. Don thought he was starving me of relevance by cutting me out of meetings, removing me from Slack channels. What he didn't realize was that he had only tightened the rope. All I needed to do now was wait. Silence is underestimated. It stretches, it suffocates, it sharpens the fear in people's voices when they finally realize they've missed something vital. Have you ever held on to a secret like that one piece of knowledge that could flip the entire story upside down? If you know what it feels like to sit with power no one else can see, leave me a comment. And if you want to hear exactly how that silence exploded into chaos, subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see what happens next. By 6 o'clock, I shut down my laptop and slipped a small encrypted hard drive into my bag. Every dependency mapped, every backup logged. I walked out into the cool evening air as though it were any other night. But I knew the truth. The office was a building full of people celebrating on borrowed time. The confetti was gone, the speeches finished, but the countdown was still ticking. And when it stopped, no one, not Don, not the VP, not the CEO, could claim ignorance. Because when that silence finally broke, it would roar louder than any celebration they'd ever thrown. The next morning, the silence got louder. Not the absence of noise, but the kind of engineered silence you feel when someone thinks they're being strategic. At 9:17 a.m., my Slack suddenly blinked and a message flashed across the top of the screen. You no longer have access to this workspace. Just like that, I was gone. 1 second, I was replying to a thread about integrating new endpoints. The next, I was staring at a gray screen kicked out like a trespasser. A few minutes later, my invite for the daily stand-up vanished from my calendar. Then the notifications stopped. No more pings, no more mentions, no more quick asks. They were icing me out. Don must have thought he was clever. Contain the fallout, starve me of information, restructure the team quietly. If he could push me out of the circle, maybe I'd give up. Maybe I'd walk away, quietly fade into the archives of HR like so many others. But Don didn't realize who he was dealing with. I opened a new spreadsheet and titled it Critical Dependencies Analytics V3.6. Slowly, meticulously, I began listing every single process that depended on me. The daily sales dashboards for the board, the customer churn models for the quarterly call, the forecasting pipeline the CFO swore by, the Python scripts running on cron jobs I had written during a blizzard last February, while Don worked from home, his Wi-Fi barely holding. By lunchtime, I had cataloged 43 systems tied to my codebase. By evening, the number had grown to 68. By midnight, 92. Each entry had a description, an owner, and a simple column labeled Breakpoint Without License. Spoiler: most would collapse within 72 hours of an audit. Yes, I leaned back, stretching my sore shoulders, staring at the spreadsheet like a battlefield map. Don thought cutting me out of Slack would neutralize me. All he'd really done was show his hand. He was gambling the company's survival on the hope that I wouldn't pull the trigger. Arrogance is a dangerous currency, and Don had been spending it like water. The next day, I watched him swagger through the office headset on voice booming about next phase scalability. He didn't even glance at me. He thought the problem was solved, that isolating me had turned me into a ghost. And maybe I was. A ghost in the machine. But unlike most ghosts, I wasn't powerless. I had built the system's skeleton, and I knew exactly where the bones would break. And let me pause here to ask you, have you ever been pushed out, silenced, made to feel like you didn't matter? What did you do? Did you walk away, or did you bide your time? Share it below. Because stories like these, they're the ones that remind us we're not alone. And if you want to know how I turned their silence into their downfall, subscribe. You won't want to miss the next twist. That night, I walked out of the building with the same calm as before, my encrypted hard drive resting heavy in my bag. On the surface, nothing had changed, but I knew the truth. Don had just tightened the rope. He thought he was controlling the fire. In reality, he had poured gasoline. The building glowed behind me, towers of glass filled with people who thought they'd erased me. But you can't erase the person who wrote the rules. The countdown was still ticking, and when the timer hit 0, their empire would discover the cost of mistaking silence for weakness. It was Thursday morning when the game shifted. The silence I'd been waiting for finally cracked. Not with panic yet, but with the kind of sharp edge only lawyers know how to wield. At 10:04 a.m., an email landed in my inbox. It was short, polite, but loaded like a revolver. Subject: follow-up on Appendix D, Rebecca Chen, lead counsel. Don, could you confirm current compensation alignment to ensure license compliance? And there it was. Rebecca had found the clause. I leaned back, fingers steepled under my chin, heart steady. She hadn't copied me by accident. She wanted me to know the knife was now on the table. Don didn't reply, not right away. His Slack status flickered between active and in a meeting like a heartbeat under stress. Hours passed. Still no answer. No. By mid-afternoon, Rebecca followed up again. Just want to confirm status. This is time-sensitive. Her words were calm, surgical. But I knew what they meant. If this isn't fixed, we're operating illegally. That night, I went home, poured a glass of wine, and stared at the spreadsheet I had built 92 critical systems, each one tied to my code, each one living or dying by the validity of that contract. Don could ignore Rebecca all he wanted, but he couldn't ignore gravity. The next morning, I wasn't invited to the meeting in Conference Room C, but I didn't need to be. Rebecca had pulled HR Finance and Don into the room. I could picture it perfectly. Don, red-faced HR, fumbling through excuses, Finance flipping desperately through spreadsheets. Rebecca sat at the head, her laptop open, fingers steepled, voice calm. "I want to verify something," she began. "Is Allison Brooks currently in compensated employment status?" HR jumped in quickly. "She's active, not terminated." Rebecca shook her head. "That's not what I asked. Has she been paid?" Silence. Finance finally admitted it. My Q2 performance bonus was still under review. No disbursement. Dawn tried to cover babbling about policy-level stuff, but Rebecca raised her hand and closed her laptop with a quiet snap. Not a slam, not anger, just finality. "If she's unpaid," she said, her voice low but deadly, "we're in breach." HR blinked. "Breach of what?" Rebecca's eyes were ice. Clause 13.2, subsection D. The license agreement that grants us legal access to 97% of our analytics infrastructure. The room must have gone silent, then the kind of silence that makes your stomach drop, that makes you realize you've been standing on a landmine all along. Dawn tried to laugh. "That's just boilerplate." "No," Rebecca said softly, so softly it froze the air. "It's not." I could almost hear the panic vibrating through the walls. And let me pause here. Have you ever watched arrogance finally collide with reality? That moment when someone who thought they were untouchable realizes the ground under them is gone. If you have, tell me in the comments. And if you're curious how fast this arrogance unraveled, subscribe. Because trust me, the silence that followed was just the beginning. Rebecca leaned forward, elbows on the table. "If this isn't resolved by end of day, I'll be filing a formal notification with outside counsel and the vendor's compliance team." Then she stood, adjusted her blazer, and added without looking back, "And if you think she's bluffing, you should read the rest of the contract. She wrote most of it." I imagined Don's face, then the dawning horror. He had thought he could erase me with a shrug and a smirk. Now the very clause he ignored was a noose tightening around his career. I wasn't in that room. I didn't need to be. My name was already there, etched into every page of that contract, echoing in every silence they could no longer escape. The war I'd been preparing for had just gone from theory to reality, and Don had already lost. The email storm began before sunrise on Monday. My phone buzzed off the nightstand at 5:41 a.m., filling with notifications like a dam about to break. By the time I reached the office, the air was heavy, brittle, the way a room feels just before a thunderclap. The entire analytics team had been yanked into an emergency all-hands. Don stood at the front, collar damp, his voice pitched higher than usual. "We're experiencing, a temporary licensing complication," he stammered, clicking through slides that looked hastily assembled. Phrases like risk mitigation and vendor communication glowed on the screen, but nobody missed the tremor in his hands. Behind him, Rebecca sat silently with her laptop closed, arms folded. She didn't need slides. She had the clause. Half the team already knew what this meant. They whispered in the back row, trading worried glances. Some had been around long enough to remember the last time a contract breach shut down our systems for a week. That had cost millions. This one, bigger, much bigger. At 11:07 a.m., the hammer dropped. Finance sent a company-wide notice effective immediately. Non-essential analytics processes will be suspended pending resolution. Translation: the backbone of operations had just been unplugged. Suddenly, dashboards flickered out. Sales couldn't see daily revenue numbers. Marketing lost their ad attribution. The CEO's phone started buzzing mid-meeting when the investor portal displayed nothing but error codes. By noon, panic was spreading like wildfire. Project managers swarmed Don's desk. Engineers demanded clarity. The intern pool kids, barely out of college, huddled in corners, terrified they'd lose their jobs. I watched all of it unfold from my desk, silent. My name wasn't on any emails, but my fingerprints were everywhere. 92 systems, each of them choking without the license tied to me. And then the phone calls began. First HR, then finance, then the COO himself. They weren't calling Don anymore. They were calling me. Allison, the COO, said, his voice tight but measured, "We need to resolve this. Today." Resolve it. Funny word. As though I'd created the mess. As though I owed them the fire extinguisher. I thought back to every moment Don had dismissed me, every laugh behind closed doors, every time he'd said, "That's not your concern." Now suddenly, everything was my concern. I didn't gloat, not outwardly. Instead, I spoke calmly, clearly, like a doctor explaining a diagnosis. "This isn't a technical issue," I told them. "It's contractual. Pay the bonus, activate the clause, restore compliance. That's it." Silence, then a reluctant "we'll look into it." By evening, the building felt hollow. The usual hum of code deploys and Slack chatter had been replaced by anxious footsteps and half-whispered conversations. I passed a glass conference room where Dawn sat slumped, tie-loosened face, pale. Rebecca stood by the window phone, pressed to her ear, speaking too low to hear. The empire was cracking, not with explosions, but with fractures spreading beneath the surface, tiny fissures in the glass they'd thought was bulletproof. And let me pause, have you ever seen a system collapse, not because of sabotage, but because someone thought the rules didn't matter? If you've lived through that kind of chaos, drop your story in the comments. And if you want to know how far this collapse reached, make sure you're subscribed. The next part is where the ground truly gives way. That night, as I packed my bag, I glanced once more at the glow of servers in the basement below. So many blinking lights, each one silently screaming the same truth: nothing runs without the contract. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. The silence of the building was its own farewell. What Don thought was a victory cutting me out, silencing me, had become the very noose tightening around his career. And tomorrow the rope would pull tighter. The next morning the building looked different. Not physically, same glass facade, same humming badge scanners, but the atmosphere was unmistakably altered. A company that had always strutted like a peacock now moved like a bird with broken wings. At 8:30 a.m., the executive board gathered in the 11th floor war room. This time the blinds were drawn and the atmosphere was closer to a courtroom than a meeting. Rebecca opened the session, voice steady, almost merciless. "We are in breach. This isn't a risk, it's reality. Unless Allison Brooks is compensated according to the agreement, our license is invalid. That means every analysis we run, every client report we ship is technically unlawful." Her words landed like thunder. A few VPs glanced nervously at each other. One cleared his throat, mumbling something about internal discretion, but Rebecca cut him off. "You can't discretion your way out of federal compliance." All eyes shifted to Don. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, suit hanging awkwardly, dark circles under his eyes. He stammered, "We were handling it internally. HR just needs to—" Rebecca didn't raise her voice, but her next words sliced through the room. "You've had 3 months. Handle it now, or I file breach notifications before lunch." That was the moment the room turned. For weeks, Don had carried himself like the untouchable architect of our empire. Now, he was a liability. The same executives who had laughed at his jokes were suddenly looking at him as though he were a sinking ship. From my desk downstairs, I watched the fallout ripple outward. Senior managers whispering in hallways, HR sprinting between offices, finance huddled over laptops like surgeons trying to resuscitate a dying patient. Then came the real blow. The CEO himself, a man who rarely appeared outside investor calls, marched into the war room. His voice, when it finally cut through, was cold enough to freeze steel. "Don, you've endangered the company. We will fix this today. If that means paying Allison, we'll pay her. If that means restructuring leadership, we'll restructure." The silence that followed was almost holy. Don tried to protest. "It's a misunderstanding," but the CEO's glare shut him down instantly. By noon, whispers spread like wildfire. People said Don had been stripped of his decision-making authority. Others swore they saw him packing up his office. I sat quietly sipping coffee, letting the storm swirl around me. My phone buzzed with messages, coworkers who had ignored me for months now, suddenly flooding me with questions, sympathy, even apologies. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because the truth was finally undeniable. I wasn't the liability. I was the backbone. And let me ask you, have you ever seen someone fall from power because of their own arrogance? That moment when the person who thought they could silence you suddenly finds themselves silenced. If you've ever experienced that, share it in the comments. And if you're curious how the knife twisted even deeper, make sure you're subscribed. The next part will show you just how far this reckoning went. That evening I walked past Don's office. The door was open, the desk bare except for a single cardboard box. He wasn't there. Rebecca caught my eye in the hallway. For the first time she smiled, small, almost imperceptible, but real. She didn't need to say anything. Her eyes said it all. It's over. He's finished. I went home that night not in triumph, but in clarity. It wasn't just about the bonus anymore. It wasn't even about Dawn. It was about proof. Proof that when you build something, when you anchor yourself in integrity and resilience, nobody can erase you, not with lies, not with silence, not with sabotage. And tomorrow that truth would echo louder than ever. The morning after Dawn's collapse, I walked into the office to find the place buzzing not with work, but with rumors. Slack channels were lit up like fireworks. Some said Dawn had been escorted out by security. Others whispered he was still hiding in the executive suite, bargaining for one last chance. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the shift his voice no longer carried weight. Rebecca called me upstairs. It wasn't the war room this time, it was her office, neat glass walls, skyline behind her like a crown. She gestured for me to sit, no theatrics, just calm precision. Allison, she began the board, has accepted the inevitable. Dawn is finished, but his downfall leaves us with a vacuum, and vacuums have a way of sucking people in. She leaned forward. The question is, do you want to step in or do you want to step back? For a long moment, I just stared at her. Part of me wanted to laugh. Months ago, I couldn't even get a seat at the table. Now the table was being slid toward me. But power was never my goal. Survival was. Integrity was. And I had no illusions stepping in meant inheriting Dawn's enemies as well as his allies. I told her the truth. I don't want the crown. I just want the contract honored. Rebecca studied me, expression unreadable. Then she smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips. That's exactly why you're the one they'll respect. By afternoon, the official memo dropped. Dawn had resigned to pursue other opportunities. Everyone knew what that meant. His nameplate was gone by evening, and with it the smug laughter that had once haunted every meeting. But the chaos wasn't finished. The breach had rattled investors. Clients demanded answers. We were hemorrhaging credibility by the hour. And into that storm, the CEO made his move. He announced a new compliance council with me as a founding member. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman they had sidelined was now being elevated to clean up their mess. I could feel the eyes on me in every hallway, every break room. Some were curious, some resentful, some quietly grateful. That night I lay awake, replaying the past months like a reel. Dawn's dismissive grin, the smirk when he told me that's not your concern, the nights I went home wondering if I was crazy for standing my ground, and now this. Vindication? Yes, but also responsibility. And before I go further, let me ask you something. What would you have done? Would you take the crown, knowing it might paint a target on your back, or would you step back content to let justice speak for itself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you'd play it. And if you want to see how the twist hits in the very next chapter, stay with me. Subscribe now because what comes next will show you why victory isn't always what it seems. The next morning I passed Dawn in the lobby. Yes, he was still there. Box in hand, eyes down shoulders, sagging under the weight of defeat. For the first time, he didn't look like a rival. He just looked like a man who'd gambled on arrogance and lost everything. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. He opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to defend himself, but no words came. I didn't stop. I didn't gloat. I just walked past him into the elevator doors, sliding shut between us like the final chapter of a book. The company had lost its king. The game was changing, and the twist waiting in the wings would prove that crowns are heavier than they look. When the announcement went public, the building trembled with a new kind of energy. No more whispers, no more speculation. The memo had sealed Dawn's fate. He was out. But what nobody expected was how quickly the narrative around me began to shift. One by one, people who had ignored me, doubted me, even laughed at me now approached with forced smiles and carefully chosen words. Congratulations, they said, though their eyes revealed something else: calculation. They weren't congratulating me, they were testing the waters, deciding if I was the new current to swim with or against. Rebecca wasn't blind to it. She pulled me aside and said, "Watch them. Power isn't about titles, it's about leverage. And right now, you have more than anyone here realizes." At first I thought she was exaggerating, but then the CEO himself summoned me for a private conversation. His office was sterile like an aircraft hangar with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Allison, he said you understand the compliance breach better than anyone. That's why I put you on the council. But understand this, our competitors are watching. If word spreads that we can't protect our IP, we'll bleed clients. Your role isn't just about fixing the mess, it's about being the face of integrity. The words struck me. The face of integrity. The same integrity they had mocked, sidelined, nearly erased was now their shield. And then he added almost casually, "You'll be speaking at the investor call next week." My breath caught. For months, I couldn't even get a seat at the conference table. Now they wanted me to address the very people who funded the empire. That night, the weight pressed on me. I walked the city streets, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement, asking myself if this was truly a victory or just another trap. Because power, I realized, doesn't only topple kings like Don, it also devours those who step in to clean up the ruins. Still, a quiet flame burned inside me. For the first time, I wasn't being silenced, I wasn't being brushed aside. My voice was no longer an interruption, it was the headline. And let me pause here to ask you, have you ever been underestimated, only to find yourself suddenly thrust into the spotlight? What did you do? Did you rise to the moment, or did you step back? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the twist that's about to unravel. Because the next move will prove that the story wasn't over, it was only changing form. The following morning, I walked into the office early before the rush, hoping for silence. Instead, I found Don's office door wide open. Inside, the shelves were empty, the blinds half drawn. But something caught my eye on the desk, a single folder left behind almost too deliberately. Curiosity gnawed at me. I stepped inside, opened it, and my pulse spiked. Inside were documents, emails, memos, and confidential drafts that hinted at something darker. Don hadn't just been arrogant. He had been covering up vulnerabilities in our core technology, masking flaws that could cripple us if revealed. My stomach tightened. His downfall wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a deeper rot that nobody else had noticed. And in that moment, I understood the real storm hadn't even hit yet. The folder in Don's office felt like a live wire in my hands. Each page hummed with the weight of secrets no one had intended for me to see. Technical diagrams with red annotations screamed of vulnerabilities hidden deep in our core product. Internal memos showed Don had known and buried the truth months before the breach. Worse, he had looped in select allies to keep the cover-up airtight. I sat there, my heart pounding, wondering if Don had left this behind as a trap or as a desperate cry for relevance. Either way, it meant something explosive. His arrogance wasn't just personal. It was systemic. By the time I slipped the folder into my bag, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The council had to see it. But as I walked into the glass conference room the next morning, I stopped cold. There they were 3 executives I recognized from the memos. And they weren't whispering, they were laughing. Not the easy laughter of relief, but the sharp, brittle kind you hear in cornered animals. Rebecca caught my eye and gave the slightest shake of her head. Not yet, her look said. The CEO entered moments later, and the laughter evaporated. He launched straight into strategy, rattling off plans for investor reassurance. I sat still, folder heavy in my lap, my mind spiraling. To speak now meant detonating the whole room. To wait meant letting rot fester deeper. After the meeting, Rebecca cornered me in the hallway. "You found something, didn't you?" Her voice was a whisper, but her eyes were steel. I handed her the folder. She scanned the first page, her face tightening. This could destroy us. Her words froze me. Because they weren't laced with denial or shock. They were pragmatic, calculating. She wasn't asking if it was true, she was already plotting how to manage the fallout. That night, I couldn't sleep. My apartment window rattled with the storm outside, rain hammering the glass like a relentless drum. In the shadows of my living room, I kept replaying the same thought. Was this justice or just another cover-up waiting to happen? For weeks, I had fought to have my voice heard. Now my voice could be the grenade that blew the company apart. And here's where I'll pull you in. What would you do if you discovered proof that could vindicate everything you'd said, but also shatter the lives of thousands who had nothing to do with the crime? Would you light the fuse or bury the evidence to save the innocent? Tell me in the comments, because this is the kind of crossroads that defines a person. And if you haven't yet, subscribe now, because the next step I took changed not only my life, but the future of the company forever. The storm outside raged into morning. By the time I returned to the office, my decision was carved in stone. I walked into the council room, folder in hand, and placed it on the table. "We need to talk," I said, voice steady. The silence that followed was suffocating. One by one, their eyes locked on me. Some were wide with fear, others narrowed with calculation. And then the CEO leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Allison," he said almost softly, "do you realize what you're holding? This isn't just Don's legacy. It's the company's backbone. Expose it, and you don't just end him. You end us." The weight of his words pressed down, but I didn't flinch. "Maybe ending us," I replied, "is the only way to save what's left." The room erupted, shouts, denials, threats tossed like daggers. But I had said it. The line had been drawn. And in that moment, I knew the storm outside wasn't just weather. It was a mirror of the war now raging inside these walls. The twist had landed, and nothing would be the same. The council chamber was thick with tension. Voices clashed, chairs scraped, and the polished table became a battlefield of words. Half the executives argued for silence, desperate to protect their reputations and stock options. The other half, emboldened by the evidence, demanded accountability. I sat at the center, feeling every eye on me. For so long I had been the quiet one, the analyst, the note-taker, the invisible presence in the room. Now my words carried more weight than any title on a business card. Rebecca spoke first. "If we bury this, we're no better than Don. Allison's right. The rot has to be cut out even if it means bleeding." A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded, others glared daggers. Then the CEO leaned forward, his voice calm but cold. "Allison, understand this. If you go public, you won't just bring down Don. You'll bring down us. You'll bring down yourself." For a moment, fear threatened to choke me. He wasn't wrong. My career, my future, even my safety, everything was on the line. But then I remembered the hollow applause at my award night, the countless times I'd been silenced, the faces of employees who believed their voices didn't matter. I stood, my hands trembling, but my voice steady. Integrity isn't a brand strategy, it's not a press release. It's doing the right thing when it costs the most. And right now, it costs everything. Silence fell. No one dared to move. And in that silence, I pulled out my phone, opened the folder's contents, and hit send, distributing the documents to regulatory bodies, the press, and every employee in the company. The explosion was immediate. Phones lit up around the table screens, flashing with alerts as the truth spread like wildfire. Gasps filled the room. Some executives cursed my name. Others looked relieved, as if I had freed them from a prison of complicity. The CEO slammed his fist on the table. "You've destroyed us," he hissed. "No," I said, my voice firmer now. "I've saved what's worth saving. The rest needed to burn." Rebecca touched my arm, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and admiration. "You just set history in motion," she whispered. And she was right. Within hours, headlines blazed across the country, major tech giant exposed in compliance scandal. Investors panicked, but employees rallied. For the first time in years, they saw someone put truth above profit. That night, walking home through streets buzzing with the fallout, I felt lighter than I had in years. The company might crumble, but I had reclaimed something far greater: my voice, my agency, my freedom. And here's where I'll leave you with one last thought. When you stand at the crossroads of silence and truth, which path will you take? Would you risk everything to do what's right, or would you choose safety and live with the weight of compromise? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story has moved you, subscribe now, because the next chapter of this journey will take us deeper into what it means to rebuild after the fire. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled of smoke. I looked at the skyline lights flickering in towers of glass and steel, and realized that sometimes the only way to protect a future is to let the present burn. The game was over, and yet, in a strange way, it felt like I had just begun. In the weeks that followed, life shifted in ways I couldn't have predicted. The company, once a towering monument to ambition, staggered under the weight of exposure. Lawsuits piled up, executives resigned, and Don's name became a cautionary tale whispered in industry circles. But outside those walls, something remarkable happened. Ordinary employees, coders, designers, assistants began sharing their own stories. They spoke of years of being silenced, ignored, or overlooked. My choice had cracked the dam, and their voices poured out unstoppable and true. I remember standing in a small cafe one morning, coffee warming my hands, when a young intern approached me. She looked nervous, then smiled shyly. "Because of you," she said, "I finally believe someone like me matters." Her words echoed louder than any headline. In the quiet that followed the storm, I learned an unexpected truth. Integrity doesn't just rebuild companies, it rebuilds people. And in that rebuilding, we find resilience. As for me, I didn't walk away with wealth, power, or prestige. What I carried instead was freedom. The freedom to know I had spoken when it mattered most. The freedom to stand tall in the mirror each morning without flinching. So if you're watching this and facing your own storm, remember this. Silence may feel safe, but it builds a cage around your spirit. Speak your truth even if your voice shakes. Because sometimes the only way to truly win is to lose everything that was never worth keeping. And if this story has touched you, stay with me. Subscribe, share, and join this community because together, we'll keep exploring the battles, betrayals, and choices that define us. The fire has burned out, but from the ashes, something stronger always rises.